Hey there, my name is Robbie Andrus. I'm a postdoc at Washington State University in the School of the Environment. Today, I want to share with you the results of a field study, Spatiotemporal drivers of post-fire conifer establishment and growth in a managed forest landscape. Climate is driving important shifts in fire regimes. The figure on the left illustrates area burned in green and area burned at high severity in purple, and their increase from 1985 to 2018. This is largely due to increases in temperature and drier conditions during the summer. This is driving important shifts in forest communities. As a result, there's been a lot of interest in looking at post-fire communities of trees and important shifts that those communities might sort of forecast for future forests. So in this study, we're interested in looking at factors that are driving post-fire seedling establishment as well as growth. In the Western United States, there are a lot of conifers, and in this ecosystem that I'm working in, specifically in southeastern part of Washington State, we have 6 different conifer species, and all of which are wind dispersed, have wind dispersed seeds, and do not resprout. So these species depend on seed being dispersed from surviving trees and the unburned forest edge into burned sites for post-fire recovery. So when seed arrives at a site, climate conditions must be suitable for germination and survival. And then topography also creates an important variability in soil moisture. As we can see illustrated here, lots of regeneration sort of on the north aspect and much less regeneration on the south aspect. Understory cover is also important. Competition and for resources such as soil moisture and other nutrients from shrubs and grasses can also affect densities of seedlings post-fire. And tree species have different tolerances to drought and the post-fire environment, which may drive variability in post-fire regeneration density. Management practices are also important. Following fire, many forests are salvage logged to remove merchantable timber. As a result of that, there may be trampling or other effects on those post-fire communities. Seeding of native grasses is also a common practice to reduce erosion, and that may also have important effects. In this research, we were interested in answering 2 questions. The densities of post-fire regeneration meet silvicultural stocking recommendations, specifically because we're working in a managed post-fire landscape. The second question was, how is post-fire seedling establishment and height growth affected by climate, fire severity, topography, understory cover, and post-fire management? In this study, we looked at the school fire. We chose the school fire because many post-fire regeneration density plots had been measured in 2011, and we wanted to go back in 2021 and remeasure those post-fire communities and look at changes in tree densities and composition and those sort of things. So this fire burned about 21,000 hectares. It says acres, but that's actually hectares. Elevation about 1,200 to 1,500 meters. Annual precip is 65 to 100 centimeters, which is actually relatively high, not at the forest grassland ecotone. So the conditions for regeneration, the amount of moisture received here should be relatively good, and we would sort of maybe from that expect a recovery of those forests. These forests experience salvage logging and seeding of native grasses following fire. The sort of 3 different general forest types in this area include lower elevation forest, ponderosa pine only, dry mixed conifer, ponderosa pine, Doug fir, and grand fir. At the highest elevation, we have the sort of mesic mixed conifer sort of / subalpine forest. It also includes western larch lodgepole pine and Engelmann spruce. So moisture deficits in the school fire, as I was mentioning, in relation to precipitation, are relatively low. So we'd that was based on 1980 to 2010 normals in comparison to the distribution of these species throughout the Pacific Northwest. So we'd expect decent recovery of forest in these areas. We remeasured some transects that were installed in 2011, measured those in 2021. They're 60-meter long belt transects that were between 1 and 10 meters wide. Each seedling we encountered, we measured the height, assessed it for species. We also measured the interannual growth using the Budscar method. So here, jumping into some results, natural post-fire regeneration was really abundant and widespread in the school fire. comparison to some of the areas that I've worked in Colorado and observed in other places in the Western United States, there was really high densities of post-fire regeneration. We found post-fire regeneration in all of our plots, and the seedling densities on average were about a little over 2,000 in 2011 and up to close to 3,000 in 2021. So clearly, in general, these forests do appear to be recovering. So to answer this question, did post-fire stem densities meet silvicultural stocking recommendations? I use two thresholds that are sort of common. One, a very low threshold that's conservative and is a common threshold at very low elevation for ponderosa pine forests. So the figure here on the left illustrates two stocking density thresholds on the x-axis and the percent of plots below that threshold on the y-axis. And orange illustrates 2011 with gray in 2021. So we can see that the number of plots not meeting that threshold in 2011 was much higher than it was in 2021. And by 2021, about only 40% of the plots did not meet that 60 stems per hectare threshold. So these were our lowest elevation sites that sort of look like this, the lowest elevation dry, warm sites where we would sort of expect to see transitions from forest to non-forest. And it appears that we are seeing this in a couple of our sites in the school fire. Previous work from the Blue Mountains, which is where the school fire is located, found that 17 to 33% of the plots did not have any post-fire regeneration. But like I said before, we found post-fire regeneration. So it appears that areas in the Blue Mountains may be susceptible from transitions to forest to non-forest at these very low elevation, warm, dry sites. Okay, the next thing we were interested in looking at was temporal drivers of variability in post-fire seedling establishment. So this graph here, the top graph is a SPEI, or a drought index, with cooler, wetter conditions on the top and warmer, drier conditions on the bottom. The x-axis is time from 2005 when the fire occurred up to 2012. And each row is a different species, so ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, and grand fir. These are the number of stems per hectare that established based on bud scar counts. So what just sort of pops out to me here is that the 2008 to 2010 time period is much cooler and wetter, and we had much higher levels of seedling establishment for grand fir and ponderosa pine. Douglas fir was quite a bit different. We also looked at the same thing for western large lodgepole pine and Engelmann spruce, and again, very high peak in establishment in that 2008-2009 time period. So we ran Spearman correlations between these, the climate and the seedling establishment for each species, and found that for all species but Douglas fir, that cooler and wetter conditions during the summer were conducive to seedling establishment, while for Douglas fir it was much the opposite. Warmer and drier conditions during the summer led to more establishment. So this is only for 6 years, but is an interesting insight for a bunch of different species to see that warmer and drier conditions are an important limitation to post-fire establishment. So to look at the drivers of spatial variability in post-fire juvenile densities, we created 4 different generalized linear mix models predicting juvenile density from a slew of different predictor variables that are known to be important for driving the spatial variability in juvenile densities. So the 4 models included an all species model, grand fir model, Douglas fir, and ponderosa pine. So the first variable that I'll talk about that was important was distance to seed sources. So distance to seed sources greater than about 175 meters, which is about the distance that these wind dispersed seeds can go. Distances greater than 175 meter generally led to much lower levels of juvenile densities. Grass percentage had a negative effect. In this case, it was interesting that many of these plots with the highest cover of grass were actually seeded. So grass seeded plots had about 2,500 fewer stems per hectare. This doesn't mean that they are going to fail in their recovery effort, but they definitely have much lower densities of juveniles. Aspect. The other thing I should point out about this figure is those variables that have a circle are not significant, and those variables that have a triangle are significant. So for this variable, we illustrate that slope aspect actually didn't have a really strong effect for most of the relationships. But in general, the negative effect shows that warmer and drier slope aspects generally decrease juvenile densities. Oops. Salvage logging had no effect for any of our models. And the positive association here illustrates that for all the models, there was an increase in seedling density over time. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to drivers of the spatial variability and post-fire juvenile height growth, which has not really been the subject of very many studies. So the first thing we found here is on the x-axis, we have height. On the y-axis, we have height growth. So as seedlings and saplings get larger, they generally increase in height growth, which is not a surprise. We only looked at this for Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, and grand fir because those are the only ones we had sufficient data for. The more interesting result is that this heat load index at HLI, which goes from cooler, wetter to warmer, drier, we found that as you move to these warmer, drier sites, you generally have less height growth, which is interesting. Keep that in mind here. So now we're going to move on to drivers of temporal variability and post-fire temporal variability and post-fire juvenile height growth. So what was the climate effect in this case? And so we created a height growth index that accounted for growth, increases in height with growth. And we used the Spearman's correlation to relate that to monthly SPEI from the year prior to growth to the year of growth. We found no statistical relationships for grand fir or Doug fir, but for ponderosa pine, we found that the spring prior, the April, May, June prior, and the June of growth had a negative correlation with height growth. So what does this mean? This means that warmer and drier conditions in the spring prior or the spring of growth led to greater height growth, which is counter to what the model of spatial variability that I just shared with you illustrated. So I thought that was an interesting contrast there. Okay, just to summarize the results. Natural post-fire generation was widespread and abundant in the school fire. Density increased over time. Okay, so in terms of the post-fire management effects, we found that the seeding of native grass species actually had a negative effect on density. While it might have really positive effects in terms of stabilizing slopes and reducing erosion, it had a negative effect on post-fire regeneration. Though it's important to note also that this effect didn't necessarily push those communities below any of the silvicultural stocking thresholds. Here we showed that salvage logging had no effect, which is consistent with research from the greater Pacific Northwest suggesting that salvage logging doesn't affect post-fire juvenile density. Okay, and the next thing we looked at was topographic effects. We found that in general that warmer and drier sites had lower densities of juveniles, as well as a negative effect on height growth for multiple species. In terms of the implications of climate warming, we found that warmer and drier conditions were unfavorable for post-fire seedling establishment for ponderosa and grand fir, for example, but not Douglas fir. But these warmer and drier conditions were actually favorable for juvenile height growth for ponderosa pine only. So, there's an interesting contrast here between, the factors that affect density and the factors that affect height growth, and they're not necessarily always the same. So, just wrapping this all together, looks like the school fire is regenerating quite well, but climate change is likely to have some important effects on height growth over time. Thanks for listening, and please let me know if you have any questions. You can leave those in the questions or the chat box down below. Thank you.